A low, frantic bleat pierced the lazy hum of a summer afternoon, echoing across my field as I adjusted the lens on my hidden camera. I hadn't expected anything unusual when I set up my camcorder behind the old barn that day, but what I caught on tape made my heart sink. In the midst of a makeshift backyard gathering, a group of unruly guests huddled around a sizzling grill, their laughter mixing with the unmistakable aroma of charcoal and spices. But the real shocker? At the center of the scene, Karen, our notorious neighborhood enforcer, was hoisting my baby goat like it was a prize cut of meat. The baby goat, normally a timid bundle of bleats and curious sniffs, now dangled awkwardly from a rope, its wide eyes reflecting both confusion and distress. The guests cheered and egged each other on as Karen proudly declared that the community barbecue would feature an unexpected main course. I felt a surge of outrage as I watched, powerless, while my hidden camera recorded every heartless moment in high definition. In that instant, the absurdity of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. A woman obsessed with enforcing petty neighborhood rules had crossed every boundary by commandeering my farm animal for her own twisted idea of a celebration. It was an act so ludicrous that it would soon send shockwaves throughout our community. If only I could make sure it was seen by everyone before the cops stepped in to shut it down. The stage was set for a confrontation that was as outrageous as it was inevitable. I knew I had to expose Karen's abuse of power, not just for the sake of my baby goat, but to stand up for every resident who'd ever been bullied by arbitrary HOA edicts. And so, with adrenaline surging and my camera rolling, I prepared to document a moment that would forever change the way our neighborhood viewed authority and personal freedom. Cedar Glen Estates was a picture-perfect, tightly controlled, gated community where every house was trimmed to exacting standards and every lawn meticulously maintained. The residents prided themselves on uniformity, and the homeowners association ruled with an iron fist. Their bylaws were as detailed as a legal document, and any deviation, no matter how minor, was met with swift and uncompromising discipline. At the center of this regimented order was Karen Douglas, infamously known as HOA Karen. In her late 40s, Karen was the walking embodiment of the community's strict standards. Always seen in perfectly pressed blouses and pencil skirts, she roamed Cedar Glen with a clipboard clutched tightly in her hand and a smartphone in the other. To her, every stray decoration, every burst of color, was an affront to the pristine image she was determined to preserve. I, on the other hand, was a longtime resident who cherished the freedom to live on my own terms. My modest farm, tucked away on the outskirts of Cedar Glen, was a testament to the beauty of rural independence. It was here that I raised a small herd of animals and grew organic produce, and where my baby goat, a gentle, curious creature that had become the darling of my little farm, held a special place in my heart. Unlike the rest of Cedar Glen, my property was a blend of creative chaos and hard-won tradition. I had built a life here that celebrated individuality over conformity, a life that clashed with the rigid rules imposed by the HOA. For years, I'd endured Karen's relentless fines and admonishments for what she deemed unauthorized modifications. Whether it was my eclectic garden decor or the quirky displays on my farmhouse porch, nothing escaped her watchful eye. Yet, despite all her efforts, I continued to thrive, stubbornly embracing a lifestyle that defied the cookie-cutter image of Cedar Glen. Then came the day that changed everything. Without any warning or consent, Karen decided to throw a community barbecue right on my land. Not content with simply holding the event, she took it upon herself to enhance the festivities by appropriating my baby goat as the centerpiece of her so-called culinary extravaganza. The audacity of it all was staggering. A woman determined to enforce order had crossed the ultimate line by commandeering a living creature for my care. The stage was set for an epic showdown, a clash between Karen's draconian vision of order and my fierce commitment to protecting my property and my freedom. I knew that if I didn't act, not only would my baby goat suffer, but so would the very spirit of independence that I had fought so hard to preserve. And so, with my hidden camera rolling and my resolve hardening, I prepared to expose the absurdity of it all. The events unfolded in slow motion on that fateful afternoon. I had installed hidden cameras around my property long ago, not to spy on my neighbors, but to document the natural beauty and occasional mishaps of farm life. That day, as I reviewed the footage on my laptop, the reality of Karen's audacious act became undeniable. The camera caught every detail. Karen, with a self-satisfied smirk, confidently leading a group of guests toward the barn, and then, with deliberate malice, hoisting my baby goat onto a makeshift spit at the center of a bustling barbecue setup. The footage was disturbing and surreal. My baby goat, usually so gentle and curious, was now a hapless victim of Karen's misguided attempt to enforce her notion of community enhancement. The guests around her laughed and cheered, completely oblivious to the cruelty of the act. I felt a mix of horror, anger, and a deep, personal betrayal. Not only had Karen violated my trust and my property, but she had also reduced one of my most beloved animals to a mere prop in her twisted performance of authority. Immediately, I compiled the evidence, time-stamped video clips, audio recordings of Karen's call to the HOA board, and even text messages from some shocked neighbors who had witnessed the incident from afar. I then posted snippets of the footage on a private community forum, where longtime residents began to rally around me. Their responses ranged from outrage to disbelief. Many recalled previous instances where Karen had overstepped her bounds, but nothing had been as extreme as this. In the days that followed, the digital conversation exploded. Hashtags like #SaveTheGoat and #NoMoreKaren began trending in our small community. Neighbors who had long been afraid to speak out against the HOA's arbitrary rules now found their voices, sharing their own experiences and demanding accountability. The online outcry was a powerful signal that Karen's actions were not only unacceptable, they were a tipping point. I reached out to a local animal rights group, providing them with the evidence I had gathered. They were equally appalled and promised to support my case, urging me to take legal action if necessary. At the same time, I contacted a few trusted friends within the community who were experts in local governance. We discussed the broader implications. If one person could appropriate someone else's property and even harm a living creature with impunity, what was to stop her from escalating her behavior further? As the pressure mounted, Karen's smug demeanor began to crack. I started receiving messages from neighbors who, while sympathetic to my plight, were also fearful of the potential fallout. "She's always been too strict," one neighbor confided, "but I never thought she'd do something like this to a baby goat." The support was overwhelming, and it confirmed what I had long suspected. Karen's reign of petty tyranny had reached a breaking point. I resolved that I could not let this injustice go unchallenged. My next step was to prepare for a public confrontation. I reached out to a local journalist known for her hard-hitting coverage of community issues and provided her with my digital dossier. She promised to investigate further and to ensure that Karen's actions would be brought to light. The prospect of an independent media spotlight on the incident only strengthened my resolve. Meanwhile, I took additional measures to protect my remaining animals and secure my property. I installed extra cameras and reinforced the perimeter of my farm stand, determined that no further unauthorized activity would go unpunished. Every moment was meticulously documented. The setup of the barbecue, the shocked reactions of onlookers, and most importantly, Karen's blatant disregard for the sanctity of my property. As the incident continued to simmer, it became clear that this wasn't merely a case of one woman's overzealous enforcement. It was a symptom of a deeper problem in our community. The digital evidence had ignited a firestorm of debate about the balance between community standards and individual rights. And I knew that unless something was done, Karen would continue to wield her power unchecked, endangering the very freedoms that Cedar Glen was supposed to protect. Within a week of the incident, the story of my baby goat's abduction by HOA Karen spread like wildfire through Cedar Glen. Social media erupted with outrage and disbelief as video clips and screenshots of the incident were shared far and wide. Hashtags such as #SaveTheGoat, #KarenExposed, and #StopBullying trended throughout the community, and residents who had long been frustrated by arbitrary fines and intrusive measures found a common cause in my struggle. Local news stations quickly picked up the story. Reporters interviewed neighbors who expressed shock over Karen's callous act, and experts weighed in on the broader implications of allowing a single individual to enforce community rules without oversight. This is about more than just one goat, one news anchor declared during a live segment. It's about the abuse of power and the suppression of individual rights, a cautionary tale for communities everywhere. The media attention brought the issue to a new level, and before long, my digital dossier was being discussed in local government meetings and neighborhood forums. Within the HOA board, tension grew palpable. Emergency meetings were convened behind closed doors, and leaked minutes revealed a fierce internal battle. Some board members, long loyal to Karen's uncompromising approach, insisted that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain property values and order. Others, swayed by the overwhelming digital evidence and public outcry, argued that Karen's actions were an abuse of power that undermined the very spirit of community. Heated debates erupted, and the board found itself caught between preserving a legacy of strict conformity and adapting to the changing sentiments of its residents. I continued to update my online community with every development. Live streams showed snippets of my security footage, each clip a stark reminder of what had transpired. I published detailed blog posts that dissected the incident, offering a clear, factual account of Karen's unauthorized actions and their impact on my property. The digital petition calling for accountability grew by the day, amassing thousands of signatures and a resounding call for reform in the HOA's policies. Neighbors who had been silenced by fear or indifference now shared their own stories of overreach, and the collective voice of Cedar Glen grew louder and more insistent. Meanwhile, Karen's attempt to defend herself on social media only fueled the fire. In a series of hastily recorded videos, she tried to claim that her actions were a misunderstanding and that she was merely protecting community interests. But every attempt to spin her narrative was met with counter-evidence. The unmistakable footage of her hoisting my baby goat onto a makeshift spit, the disbelieving expressions of onlookers, and the digital timeline that made it clear this was no accident. The situation reached a critical juncture when local law enforcement announced they would be reviewing the case after receiving numerous complaints from residents. Though the police stated that the incident was under investigation as a potential case of animal cruelty and property infringement, the attention only served to validate the community's concerns. The prospect of legal action against Karen was both a relief and a rallying cry for those who had long chafed under her arbitrary authority. As the days passed, the tension escalated further. Community meetings became impassioned forums where residents debated the future of the HOA and the rights of property owners. At one such meeting, a longtime neighbor tearfully recounted how she had once been fined for simply planting a small flower bed in her yard. "We are all being crushed under these arbitrary rules," she declared, her voice trembling with emotion. The room erupted with support, and the digital petition's numbers soared, reinforcing the collective demand for accountability. In the midst of this growing movement, I realized that I had to ensure that the truth was heard by everyone, especially by those in power. I reached out to an investigative journalist, handing over my digital dossier and providing access to all the evidence. The journalist promised a series of in-depth reports that would expose the full extent of Karen's overreach and the HOA's complicity in enforcing these draconian measures. The prospect of a public reckoning on a broader stage galvanized the community further. By the time the final public hearing was announced, Cedar Glen was abuzz with anticipation and a newfound determination to stand up for individual rights. Neighbors organized rallies, distributed flyers, and held discussions at local cafes. The story of my baby goat's ordeal had evolved into a symbol, a rallying point for a community that was finally ready to challenge the status quo. Every shared post, every hashtag, every comment underscored one unyielding truth: property rights and creative freedom are inviolable. The decisive moment arrived on a cool, clear morning at the Cedar Glen Community Center. The boardroom was packed with a diverse mix of HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and hundreds of determined residents, all gathered for the final public hearing that would decide the future of our community's enforcement policies. With a calm yet resolute presence, Councilwoman Angela Rivera stepped up to the podium, her eyes shining with the collective hope and determination of Cedar Glen. After a thorough review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed digital logs, and the heartfelt testimonies of our residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Rivera began, her voice steady and authoritative. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Miller, specifically the unauthorized seizure and abuse of property that resulted in the distressing incident involving a baby goat, were not driven by any legitimate concern for community safety or aesthetics, but by personal bias and an abuse of power. Our community's right to private property and to express our individuality must be upheld, and no one should be allowed to impose their personal vendettas on us. A heavy silence fell over the room as Rivera continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all sanctions and fines associated with this incident, and we will launch a full disciplinary review of the practices that enabled such overreach. Furthermore, new guidelines will be implemented to protect the rights of every resident to manage their property and to express themselves creatively without fear of arbitrary interference. Today's decision is not simply about reversing an unjust fine. It is a resounding declaration that Cedar Glen stands for fairness, accountability, and the inalienable right to live without tyranny. Her words resonated powerfully, and murmurs of approval rippled through the assembly. At that moment, a respected community advocate, a stalwart defender of individual rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand united," he declared, his voice ringing with passion. "No resident should ever have their ability to live and work freely compromised by the petty whims of an overzealous enforcer. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that our community values truth, creativity, and the sanctity of private property above all else. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every infringement on our rights is met with swift, decisive action." His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting the room in a resolute call for reform. Following his powerful address, a senior officer from the local Animal Control and Property Oversight Division presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, expert testimonies, and official reports that confirmed the legitimacy of my operations and debunked every claim made by Karen Miller. The evidence was irrefutable. My farm stand operated entirely within legal boundaries, and the incident involving the baby goat was a flagrant abuse of power by an individual acting on personal vendetta. The Internal Affairs Panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures against those responsible, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Rivera concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Glen, a community where every resident's rights and creative expressions are respected, and where public authority is exercised with transparency and fairness." Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no one, regardless of their self-appointed status, can impose their will on us without accountability. Together, we stand for justice, integrity, and the right to live and innovate freely. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for property rights and creative freedom. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Glen. The days of arbitrary fines and personal vendettas were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the landmark vote, Cedar Glen underwent a remarkable transformation. News of the rescinded sanctions and the sweeping reforms enacted by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and social networks, sparking impassioned discussions about property rights, creative freedom, and responsible community governance. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines like "A New Dawn for Cedar Glen" and "Community United for Justice," celebrated the decisive actions taken to protect every resident's right to manage their own property and express themselves freely. Hashtags such as hashtag property rights, hashtag no more HO bullying, and hashtag art is freedom trended widely, reinforcing our collective determination to stand against arbitrary enforcement. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their own experiences and to envision a future where creative expression and individuality were not only tolerated but celebrated. Neighbors, who had long been intimidated by the stringent rules of the HOA, now spoke openly about their right to live on their own terms. "Our land and our art are expressions of who we are," one impassioned resident declared at a bustling meeting, his voice resonating throughout the room. The atmosphere was charged with hope, a promise that Cedar Glen would forever be a sanctuary for free expression and innovation. Within the reformed HOA board and local public safety departments, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was scrutinized fairly and that no resident would ever again suffer from arbitrary fines or undue interference. "Our duty is to protect the rights and freedoms of every member of our community," Lieutenant Reed affirmed in a follow-up press conference, reinforcing our renewed commitment to justice and integrity. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized, organizing workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns to raise awareness about property rights and the importance of creative freedom. "When we stand together, our voices have the power to transform our community," a local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring neighbors to unite in the fight for a more inclusive and equitable governance model. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to expose Karen's brazen abuse of power by using my hidden camera to capture every moment of her unauthorized barbecue of my baby goat and to bring the full force of digital evidence to light had not only reclaimed my rights, but had ignited a movement that resonated far beyond my own property. Neighbors who had long suffered under arbitrary enforcement found their voices and shared their own stories of resistance. The digital dossier that chronicled Karen's misdeeds became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and the right to live without fear of arbitrary interference. Karen, once the unchallenged enforcer of the HOA's draconian policies, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when a community stands united for justice. Her influence dwindled as digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, underscoring the need for lasting reform and the dangers of unchecked power. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Glen, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered beneath the gentle glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading, "Unity, Freedom, and Property Rights" was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate not only our victory over arbitrary interference, but also the strength of a community that dares to stand for its rights, Councilwoman Rivera proclaimed, her voice steady and inspiring. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protect our freedoms and ensure that no one can abuse public power again. As each new day dawned over Cedar Glen, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Karen took my baby goat for a barbecue, and how my hidden camera exposed every callous detail before the cops shut it down, became a rallying cry for every resident who believed that private property and personal freedom were inviolable. Every sunrise now carried the promise that in Cedar Glen, truth, justice, and creative resistance would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Glen would forever be a place where freedom, integrity, and the spirit of creative rebellion shone brighter than ever.